Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being with us at this early hour in the morning. I'm very happy to welcome you to the panel on data quality, an often overlooked aspect in fundamental rights compliant data processing. The panel is organized by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, and I'm very happy to be able to chair this panel this morning. I'm Dimitrova, and I'm a researcher at Karlsruhe, where I research mainly on topics of data protection in the area of freedom, security, and justice. The panel this morning will be moderated by Elise Lassus, who is a researcher at the Fundamental Rights Agency. She's working especially on projects related to information society and its impact on fundamental rights. And she's also in charge of coordinating the agency's research and projects on privacy and data protection. And before I move on with introducing the rest of the panel, I will let Elise introduce the panel topic a bit more and welcome you too.
Thank you very much, Diana. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us, as Diana said, in this early panel on data quality. So why data quality? Why did we select this topic to be discussed this morning with you? Well, recent research have shown that data quality is becoming more and more a key aspect in order to ensure that data processing is fundamental rights compliant. Bad quality of data can have impacts on several fundamental rights. So, of course, the protection of personal data and the respect for private life are the most obvious one, but not only. Other fundamental rights can be impacted, such as non-discrimination or other. But our speakers will speak more about that in a few minutes. I will just give you one example to show you how bad quality of data can have an impact on every individual. Not only the most usual suspect, as one can say. So I will give you a personal example, actually. I was landing in Marseille this summer with my family. And as you know, in France, now you have controls before leaving the airport. And my 3-year-old son is actually registered in Interpol database. So this could be something a bit funny when it's for a 3-year-old child, and it's clearly a mistake. And very luckily, I had another piece of identification, his passport, that was not registered in the Interpol database. So we were allowed to leave the airport. But this is just to show you that mistake can happen to absolutely everybody. And this can have serious impacts on your fundamental rights. So I hope that with our speaker, we will have the chance to discuss this a bit more in details. Another very important aspect of why we chose this subject is that data quality has been surprisingly the subject of very few research. There is clearly a need for more guidance for data controllers, for data protection experts on what are the different steps that they need to implement in order to meet the data quality requirements and be fundamental rights compliant. So I will invite our speakers to speak on these challenges and on how data quality can contribute to the respect of fundamental rights. No more than 8-10 minutes, and then in order to leave space for the discussion, I will open the floor for questions. But before that, I will ask Diana to introduce our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction of the topic. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the individual speakers to you, and also give you a spoiler about the focus of their interventions. So we will first start with the data subject's perspective, setting the scene of the challenges of today and tomorrow. This aspect will be addressed by Pat Walsh, who, according to the internet, is a dead dwarf actor, previously a flying monkey. And if that left you slightly confused, I will let you stay confused until Pat can quarrel with that statement later. From the flying monkey, we will then jump to the data controller's perspective, which will be presented by Daniel Drewer, who is the data protection officer and the head of the data protection unit at Europol, the union's agency on police cooperation. Daniel will focus especially on the issues related to data quality in the context of law enforcement. Then we will move on to the perspective of the IT systems expert, with a special focus on the available IT features to ensure data quality. And this will be addressed by Athena Bourka, who is a network and information security expert at the European Agency for Network and Information Security, and she's also the DPO of ENISA. And then last but certainly not least, we will hear the perspective of the fundamental rights with a special focus on machine learning. This will be presented by Dr. David Reichel, who is a social scientist and a data analyst at the Fundamental Rights Agency, and he's responsible for managing our work on artificial intelligence, big data, and fundamental rights. Now that I have introduced all the speakers, we can pass on the floor to Pat for his intervention. Enjoy the discussion.
So, my name's Pat Walsh. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll talk about this in a little bit. But as part of this preparation for this, we were asked also to look at fundamental data quality and its impact on fundamental rights, and particularly in relation to artificial intelligence. And there are many wonderful people writing on AI and fundamental rights, but when I look through a lot of the research, I don't really see much attention being given to the aspects of data quality, and it really matters. And I think for me, when I look at the research, but I look at the implications for individuals, and I've worked in the mobile industry with telecom metadata for decades, and when I look at what data quality means, it has to be, for me, it has to begin to relate to the purpose. And it's something quite simple for me, which is the data fit for purpose? Is the processing fit for purpose? And often the purpose isn't clearly defined, particularly in relation to, say, law enforcement. And I used to support teams that did government interception and disclosure work, by the way, in addition to being a chief privacy officer. So I understand both sides of the fence. But we've seen an increase, for example, recently in the role of facial recognition being deployed in the UK, either by law enforcement agencies directly or by private entities where law enforcement are using that facial recognition capability also. And there's a lot of research done by Cardiff University. There's a case at the moment being brought in the UK in relation to the Met Police's use of facial recognition and impact on fundamental rights, which is leading to false arrest, for example. Some of the recognition technology, the artificial intelligence, can look not just at the image, but the gait and the behavior, which has, for example, led to the arrest of people who are mentally disturbed or otherwise not able to walk with a normal gait, for example. So these things do matter. There was a case just about 6 or 8 weeks ago where a guy and his wife was flying from the UK to Mexico, and he was arrested and imprisoned for 2 days in Mexico and then deported. on the basis of PNR data, for example, and the US authorities that flagged him as a person of interest that should be arrested. He had the same year of birth, but not quite the same name. So data quality actually matters. And I think also, you know, when we talk about data protection and we talk about fundamental rights, often it's the right to privacy that's mentioned. Very little discussion of the other fundamental rights and freedoms, which the GDPR, of course, is all about. And some of those freedoms, if you look at mobile phone data, for example, and yesterday there was a great discussion on some research being done in Berlin in taking mobile data, vehicle parking data, and CCTV imaging, and trying to work out for the authorities and also the law enforcement were tapping into this as well, or wanted to tap into this, to help things with city planning. This was a smart city environment where the researcher said, look, every single piece of data, the key findings of this was every single piece of data was personal data, and it was impossible to anonymize the data. So when you think about these things, and you think beyond privacy, and you think, all of you have at least one mobile phone, I assume, in your pocket, probably two, if you like most people. You've never been more connected, and that data impacts on your right to freedom of movement, your right to freedom of association, for example, your right to freedom of expression. How might that happen? Well, you know, when you analyze data, when you use artificial intelligence, it can be used, for example, to understand where people are gathering, who's gathering, where are they gathering? When people are on the way to a protest, it allows those people to be shepherded and herded and corralled. It allows people to stop people getting to the place to hear the person speaking, and therefore that interferes with that right to freedom of association, right to freedom of movement, a right to freedom of expression, which is not just a right to say something, but a right to hear something. Now this has happened, it happens in practice. So I think when we talk about data quality, it's important not just to think about whether Pat Walsh has an E or doesn't have an E on the end, but we also have to think beyond the technical dimension of this and treat it as a whole process. And in that, you also have to begin to think about ethics. So there's a good book on ethics of data and information by Dara O'Brien and Dr. Catherine O'Keefe, which talk about ethics and information quality, and that's really worth having a look at. And I think then when we come back to the GDPR, it's important. I searched the GDPR this morning because I was thinking, well, you know, it doesn't really expressly talk about data quality. You've got Article 5, 1C and 5.1D that talks about shall be adequate, relevant, not excessive kind of thing. And then, you know, it's got to be accurate and kept up to date where necessary. And if it's inaccurate, you've got to erase it, blah, 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 or correct it. How is that going to work in a world of artificial intelligence, real-time dynamic processing? For example, it will shortly be possible on your base stations, the mobile base stations that see about to put a black box on those base stations to analyze data in real time. That data may be connected to your mobile phone. It may also be connected to smart traffic lights, for example. So this thing's happening. And then searching the GDPR for data quality, really, it's only mentioned once. It's mentioned once. And that is in relation to binding corporate rules. And it says that when you use binding corporate rules, you have to specify certain things. And data quality is one of the things you have to specify. But it only mentions it in terms of that. So how does the GDPR require this then? Okay, well, you've got to, for me, think about and have a look at Recital 75, which sets out, when you're talking about fundamental rights and freedoms, that sets out some of the risks that you, under Article 24, have an obligation as data controllers to process data in a way that minimizes, foresees and minimizes risks to people's fundamental rights and freedoms. So when you look at Recital 75, it talks about some of those things. It talks, for example, about discrimination. It talks about your economic situation. So think about the use of AI in credit reporting, where credit reporting is no longer just about your credit card or your bank balance. It is about much more than that. It's about a social reputation score. And don't forget, Recital 75 also talks about reputation also as being one of the risks. So harm to your reputation. And that brings me on to this. How long have I got, Diana? Have I got about 2 minutes? So that brings me on to this, because data quality in AI, you have to have a feedback loop, right? You have to understand when things are going wrong so that you can fix them. This has been happening for a number of years. It looks funny, right? I'm a dead dwarf actor who used to be a flying monkey in The Wizard of Oz. And apparently, I live in Kansas. I've never been to Kansas. I'm still very much alive, thank you very much. I've certainly not had a problem with my height, and I've never been an actor. Now, I've asked Google a number of times to fix this. I once got it fixed by reaching out to a lawyer that I know who no longer works there. About 8 weeks ago, I emailed the chief executive of Google to see if he could help. Do you think I've received a reply? No. So it sounds really funny. It's innocuous, right? Where's the harm, Pat? Imagine if it was their formerly convicted paedophile, formerly convicted fraudster. This stuff really matters. Quality, data quality matters. It has a genuine, it can cause genuine harm. And that harm, don't forget, under the GDPR is also material and non-material. I mean, I'm not talking about the specifics today because there are some good, there are people on the panel that have some good technical detail for you. But I just wanted to get people to think about data quality. In fact, we were at breakfast this morning and I met an old friend who's a lawyer. And we were talking about, well, what does this mean? But when you look at Article 5, it says reasonable, it says necessary. Who's defining these things? These things are not defined. So you have to begin, I think, from a point of value. And I also think that it's time to move beyond data protection impact assessments when you're talking about these things. Because data protection impact assessment generally means privacy, right? That's the way it's been interpreted. We should be looking at human rights impact assessments and the values, so the impact that this has, not just on the individual, but on communities, on groups also, because particularly in the area of AI, it has the potential to particularly impact on groups and communities and to discriminate, etc. So we really need to think differently about what data quality means. And hopefully, I might get an answer to this conundrum about my previous life. Thank you.
So thank you very much for highlighting the different impact that bad data quality can have, and insisting on what you've been repeating, that data quality matters, because actually it does. Thank you also very much for putting the spotlight on how data quality is only mentioned in the GDPR. And so now I would like to ask Daniel Drewer if he can say a few words actually about how data controllers ensure that data protection requirements are met in the law enforcement sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elise. Good morning to everybody. I'm very honored for the invitation by the Fundamental Rights Agency to join this very important panel on data quality, which I think should have been given much earlier on conferences and should have more focus. I'm the data protection officer of the European Law Enforcement Agency in The Hague, and it will be no surprise to you that I have, of course, a particular perspective when it comes to data quality as a data controller. That is, of course, not the data protection officer. The data protection officer supports the data controller, but as a data protection officer of Europol, a particular perspective on the value of data quality in the databases that we hold at Europol. Pat already said it, data quality becomes particularly crucial because there are, of course, technological advances that lead to a situation that more and more data is available in general, but also more and more data is available to law enforcement. The more data, the larger the data collection, the higher the challenges to assure the data quality of each single data item that is in these databases. And of course, the larger the collections, there's also more risk that the errors in the data that lead to inaccuracies that need to be sanitized by the data controller. And if steps regarding the non-accuracy of data are not taken in a law enforcement context, we come to results that are not useful for the operational work of the police. Because data quality has, in fact, two sides. On the one side, it is, rightfully also in the title of this panel, has an impact on fundamental rights on the one side. On the other side, the police needs a high quality of data to do its job. Law enforcement needs high quality data for investigations. And there's only one point where I think interest of law enforcement meets actually interest, protection of fundamental rights and data protection. But I will try to be more specific in the points that I would like to share with you in my presentation. What is data quality for Europol as a European law enforcement organization and also as an information hub, if you want, for all law enforcement agencies of the European Union? I put 4 points in my note. It is, of course, data accuracy. It is the relevance of the data for the processing that you want to conduct. It is the data completeness. And last but not least, it must be possible, if you see the data, to understand, and it must be clear that the data can be easily understood and explained. So not data is hold, and then it is unclear what does this data actually mean. So that is for us a fourth point when we talk about data quality. How do we, in practical terms, at Europol, ensure data quality? So first of all, I'm grateful for Pat looking again into the GDPR this morning, where there's actually data quality written in this text. Europol, with more than 2 decades now of implementing a data protection regime for the information hub for law enforcement information within the European Union and beyond, had always the term data quality in its legal framework. It is an obligation for Europol and its partners that is explicitly mentioned in the Europol regulation to ensure data quality. How do we do this? Of course, data quality has to be ensured also with the technical and organizational measures that you apply to your systems. We have at Europol a secure information exchange network that connects 10,000 plus users in Europe from law enforcement agencies. We have at Europol working 100 and plus analysts looking at the personal data and, of course, strategic data that we process in our data analytical files. And data quality is mentioned in our framework as one of the obligations that Europol has to ensure together with the cooperation partners. And to answer to the initial statement made by Elise about that situation that she had with her son regarding Interpol data, I cannot talk about Interpol here. What I can say is that specifically the protection of personal data of minors is highlighted in the Europol regulation, and there is a specific focus on this. And this has also to do with data quality, because what is easier than to run through your database and with the tools that we have available in the data protection office to say, give me all personal data, date of birth of the person that is a minor. And then you have all this data, and then you check, because there obviously was a mistake. It was a matter of data accuracy. But these mistakes can be found in this way. So we have a particular focus on the protection of minors. Via this Sienna exchange system that we have for law enforcement, we have 1.1 million messages that exchanged every year. 2008, it was more than 1.1 million messages. In the Europol regulation, privacy design is described in Article 33. There is the obligation for us that in practice to implement the technical and organizational measures that guarantee data quality. We recognize at Europol that these safeguards have to be built in the system, and they are there, in fact, to support us, to ensure and take charge of our responsibility to have a high data quality in our systems. We also take up the task to promote data quality with the data providers. Europol is a law enforcement agency that doesn't own the data that we have. The data is entrusted to us. So we have a role in promoting towards law enforcement organization how important it is that high data quality is delivered to Europol. Once again, not only for fundamental rights and data protection reasons, but also for operational reasons. So, but then we provide, in this addition to this awareness, we provide trainings to the data provider. We have together awareness sessions. Now we will say, well, that sounds all very good, but how do you actually ensure then that the data that is delivered to Europol is accurate and that there's a high data quality? And there you will see, if you have a look to the Europol regulation, Article 29, is a system described that is also used by the majority of the member states, which is a 4x4 system. And I will not talk now about the SUV. I'm talking about the 4x4 system. It is a grid, actually, and that on the one side shows the accuracy of the source, and on the other side, the accuracy of the data. And Europol has the obligation, together with member states, to give to each data item such a data quality certificate, if you want. We call it the 4x4 system, and 1 is the best, and 4 is the lowest accuracy, reliability criterion that you can give. And which means for us, if we have a 1x1 information, well, that is clearly that the data quality is very high. If we have a 4x4, that is enough reasons, I'm coming to the end, that is enough reasons to have a closer look to that information and to see whether this information needs to be corrected, to go back to the data provider and see whether this data is at all reliable enough to be kept in the Europol databases. If you want, looking at this obligation of Europol to introduce this 4x4 system, you could say that Europol is even a clearinghouse when it comes to data quality. Because there's another obligation that we have, and that is, if one member state provides us with data, and we, of course, not only get from one member state, from all member states we get data, and if we understand on the basis of our analysis that the data is not accurate, that that is a data quality issue, we have even the obligation to go back, to use also that other information, and to see what we can, how we can help the data provider to work on an accuracy issue and to work on a data quality issue that might occur there. Europol has then, and that is, I think, also another important point when we talk about data quality, Europol has very strict obligations when it comes to how long we can keep the data. And if we take a decision in a framework for less than 3 years, and we have to look at a single data item, and we have to take a decision whether we want to keep the data or not, data quality is an important point here. You can assume that data with one of the lower 4x4 grades goes earlier out of our databases than the ones that gets the most accurate markings according to the 4x4 grid that we have. Last but not least, I'm data protection officer, handling data subject requests at Europol as well. I think in the law enforcement context, and I know that there's another panel today on data subject requests to law enforcement this morning. Don't underestimate, when we talk about police context, the impact handling of data subject requests have regarding to awareness, but also data quality in the database. I said to you, we have 1.1 million messages exchanged via our secure information exchange network. If we get a data subject request, and the citizen is actually with his or her data in our systems, We are not talking about a health situation of a whole file of thousands of personal data. It's then just about one personal data item. It's just one name and one surname. And if this is wrong, and that is not accurate, you can be sure that the data controller, together with the data protection officer, looks again at the overall file. But you find this one needle in a haystack that is often used when we talk about law enforcement. And that gives a test of the data quality of the file that might be just one data item against 10,000 other data subjects. Coming to the end of my presentation, which disappeared there, unfortunately. I can read it to you if you want. I think what I tried to tell you this morning is data quality is paramount to Europol, is paramount to Europol's operations. Unfortunately, my presentation didn't come up. It is paramount to our operations. It is a safeguard. High data quality is a safeguard to ensure the success of Europol's investigations, to support member states' investigations. But last but not least, data quality is also there to protect the fundamental right of the citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for reminding us that data quality is an obligation for data controller. I think it was very crucial to insist on this. Again, thank you for showing us a few of the techniques that you use at Europol in order to check the accuracy, completeness, and the different aspects of the data that you mentioned in order to be sure that data quality is respected. I am sorry that we were just informed that the projector is broken. And our next speaker had a PowerPoint presentation. So I know that the technicians are trying but if this is not an issue, you could maybe...
It's okay, I can say a few words. I'm wondering whether I could have at least the slides here so that I can see. Anyway, I think I can start already, just to say a few words. The perspective I wanted to give to this discussion is, I would say, a little bit different, although we already heard from Daniel regarding some technological solutions that can support data quality. So I wanted to look into how technology can support data quality, especially in the context of new technologies, just for example, artificial intelligence, as Pat mentioned before. I can see my presentation now, but you can't. The first point I wanted to make is that, of course, whenever we talk about this type of technologies, artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, any type of buzzword like that, you can call it as you like, we always assume that there is a tension between this technology and privacy and data protection. And of course, this is absolutely normal and expected, because these technologies create a lot more potentials for exploitation of personal data, and of course can have impact of many other fundamental rights, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers. However, the first point I wanted to make is that I wanted to quote Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, who said, we cannot blame the technology for the mistakes we make. And I guess the point I want to make here is not only, it's not only about what we do, it's also about how we do it. So in several instances, this type of technologies are not created by design in a way that they can preserve privacy and data protection, for example. And I think this is a very big issue, because then we have made a mistake, obviously. And this, I think, is a very, very important aspect to consider when we're discussing about these new technologies. So, of course, we have the legal guarantees of GDPR, as far as data protection at least is concerned. But I think we also need to consider that we also have technology on our side. So basically the point I wanted to make is that we can also use technology to face the challenges of technology. We can use privacy technology to face the challenges of artificial intelligence technology, for example. And not everything is solved, but there are several good solutions out there that they need to be considered, however, by design in the very early phases of such systems. And I believe also that this is the concept behind the obligation for data protection by design and by default that we have in GDPR. Already the previous speakers referred to the notion of data quality. What does it mean? Indeed, there is no data quality as such in GDPR. But in my mind, data quality, when it comes to personal data, it's at the end about preserving the fundamental data protection principles. So Pat already said it. It's first of all, it's about the data being fit for the purpose, and it's also about being the right data, in my opinion, and about keeping them the right time and doing the right processing on them. So it's all about the data protection principles, if we look into analytics processing, any type of analytics, you could broadly say that you have the input data, you have the processing that happens on this data, and then at the end you have the output. And I would argue that data quality, in that sense, is absolutely necessary in all those different phases, from the beginning to the end. And of course, already we heard from Daniel that the data quality is also great. We got the slides. The data quality also needs to be appropriate to the purpose itself. Obviously, the police need to have good quality of data to do their work, and I guess in all cases, whenever we are designing a system like that, we need to have very good quality for the purpose that we're designing, for the business purpose. But then we also have the dimension of quality for personal data, for the individuals in general, and I believe that these two things are very closely linked. We always, I think that in most discussions we kind of present them as being contradictory, but I believe that they're absolutely linked, because if you don't design the system in a way that can also preserve privacy and data protection, then it is also not fit for the purpose, as first of all Pat said before, and I repeat it. So how can we do that in practice? I believe that there are several privacy by design strategies in place. Of course, we cannot go in a very big detail here, but I just want to discuss, to give you only a few examples that fit also to the things that were already touched upon by the previous speakers. For example, at the input stage, obviously, we need to look at data accuracy, which is a very important issue, both for the purpose and for the personal data and for the individuals. And then, of course, another important aspect of data quality, in my opinion, is data minimization. And we should not be looking at data minimization only as the possibility of using less data. Of course, this is one aspect, using less data. But it is also about being able to do what we want to do by not using data. There are techniques, there are tools that can help us doing that. So process data without collecting the data. This is also data minimization approach. And we can see as we go through the process of an analytics processing, like a machine learning algorithm, as I have very, very simplistically presented here, I would say there are several other things we can consider, like privacy-preserving machine learning techniques, or anonymization and pseudonymization techniques. And of course, all these tools for access, rectification, so on, the whole category of transparency tools that was also touched upon. And this is also very important and needs to be thought by design. Again, of all these things need to be thought by design. That's the point I want to make here. If we have not really considered them, if they are not an integral point of the system, then of course we have made a mistake. We have not done the technology correctly. in my point of view. There are several different privacy-enhancing technologies that could be applicable in the area of big data in general, if I can put it broadly. And I'm not going to elaborate on these topics today. This is not the scope of the presentation. ENISA has done work on these fields. For example, we have published a report on privacy by design in big data, where we analyze different types of techniques that could support analytics in a privacy-enhanced way, like, for example, techniques that can allow search and analysis upon encrypted data. Now, some final thoughts. Is all this easy? Are we ready? Is it there? No, of course, this is not the answer I could give. There's a lot of work to be done. But my point here is that at the end, the very first step is planning data quality by design, is to consider these aspects, to consider how to do what we want to do in a way that will be privacy preserving. And of course, we need to work towards developing a repository of privacy-enhancing technologies. We're not there yet, but there are a lot of good technologies, as I said before, out there that need to be explored. And I believe that since technology creators are so innovative in many other aspects, they can also be very innovative, and they have been in several instances in the area of privacy-enhancing technologies. And I think that there is a role there for the industry, for the researchers, for the regulators as well, to endorse and to promote this idea. So it's not, as I said in the beginning, it's not technology against privacy. It should be technology with privacy. We should find a way to do this right so that we don't make mistakes. And of course, in this context, an important aspect when we're talking about analytics is utility, and this is clearly something that we always need to balance. And as a last point, we heard already from the previous speakers that it is very important to think beyond data protection, to broaden the scope. And I really agree with this. I think it's important. However, I just want to clarify that still, even if we manage to do that for data protection, and since we do have GDPR in place, it is already a big success. So if we manage to do this type of privacy impact assessment, if we manage to preserve data protection, it's already a very big step. And of course, we should promote it to the broader area of human rights as well further on. So with this, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Athena. And we can see that after the first presentation, we have challenges in the data quality, but now we know also that we have solutions, technical solution, and not just one. We have several of them. So I will invite you to have a look at the publications of ENISA that are describing these these privacy enhancing technologies. And now we will move on to our last speaker that will give us a presentation of data quality in machine learning, specifically from a fundamental rights perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Broadening the scope was the last point from the previous speaker. So I'd like to speak about a very specific topic on data quality. As you can see, it's on fundamental rights and data quality, the case of algorithms and machine learning. So one of the buzz terms that are currently floating around. And I would like to especially focus on the use of training data in machine learning systems from fundamental rights perspective. Just a few notes on where I'm coming from and why I'm speaking on data quality at the Fundamental Rights Agency. It's quite natural to work on data quality. It's in our mandate to collect reliable, objective, comparable data on fundamental rights issues throughout the European Union. So we do a lot of data collection. We do surveys among vulnerable groups, especially among groups where there's no data, high quality data available. So we are dealing with quality data collection in our daily business. In addition to this, in other previous FRA research on the use of biometrics in EU's large-scale databases, we also came across the topic of data quality, where it clearly came out that, especially when it comes to alphanumerical data in these databases, They are, of course, not always accurate, as we heard before, and there are issues on data quality that need to be addressed. And this also concerns biometric data, where it's often believed that this is always accurate, but even here you have to deal with data quality issues. That was highlighted in a report that we published on the topic. And it's also another topic for special groups, like biometric data for elder people or for children, raises different data quality issues. Now, I'm responsible at FRA to work on artificial intelligence and big data, so the big buzzterms. We have a project started on it where we would like to contribute to a better understanding of the fundamental rights implications of new technologies that are being discussed under the broad heading of artificial intelligence and big data. And we clearly look into the positive, but also negative impacts, because we also heard before you can use technologies to, for example, better detect fundamental rights violations. But as was mentioned quite often already, there are also threats to fundamental rights. And this way contribute to setting out fundamental rights guidelines and recommendations. Focus on contribute, because many are working on this topic at the moment, and we try to contribute from fundamental rights perspective. Just to mention, the rights impacted on by new technologies, the list is of course long, and we can actually go through the entire Charter of Fundamental Rights and find some technological developments that impact on all the rights in one way or the other. The obvious candidates are obviously data protection, freedom of expression, non-discrimination, gender equality, then importantly also the right to effective remedies and fair trial, good administration, and so forth. With our project, we try to find concrete case studies where we can then have a contextualized and balanced discussions of how in certain applications there is an impact on fundamental rights. Now, for this presentation, the starting point was we had one publication that dealt with the issue of discrimination when using algorithms, when using data to support decision making. And in this publication, we highlighted that discrimination can happen. It can happen when you use biased data, for example. Obviously, you use data to represent how people behave, and if they behave in a discriminatory manner, then this is encoded in the data. If you throw it into a machine learning algorithm, it will just perpetuate discrimination or even reinforce it. So this is one of the problems. Another is unrepresentative data. It was mentioned, I think, at the conference already several times. There's this very famous example of facial recognition technology that really had problems with gender detection of black women compared to white men especially. And the obvious problem was that it was mainly trained on white male faces. So this was just an unrepresentative data, and the tools were not fit for purpose. Luckily, someone knew about it, and this way it was found out, and now these systems are trying to be improved. Different base rates, I will not go into this. So the first 2 points are obviously a data quality issue when you use machine learning and algorithms for decision making. To audit algorithms is a challenging task. I mean, there are several stages. There's the input data that you throw in, then there's the certain transformation, a statistical process, potentially other tweaks being done to this process, and then you have the output, the prediction. So, and this we can also formalize in 3 different sets of data, which are at least involved in a machine learning process. So this mainly addresses a supervised machine learning, which is also what is mainly used, which means you have labeled data, you have a specific output, then you have other features that should predict this specific output. For example, you have many, many pictures, someone described these pictures, and then you use how the pixels are arranged and the colors to predict this specific label. So you have this training data set. This can be actually perfectly anonymized, or it can be processed in a legitimate purpose. This training data is then used to predict something. And the definition of machine learning is that an algorithm tries to generalize to new unseen data it has never seen before. And this is then this means when you apply it to individuals, you use a new set of individual data, for example, my demographic characteristics or my browsing history. And based on what the algorithm has learned, these parameters are applied to my set of individual characteristics, and then a prediction is spit out, or some categories are inferred based on this, or an action is deduced. So I see these 3 different sets of data involved in a machine learning process, focusing on the quality of training data. And as there are a lot of discussions ongoing on how to assess this data quality, and as this is clearly a work in progress, I would suggest that we strongly borrow from social science here, and especially also survey research, because survey research and social science has worked for decades on high data quality, especially when it comes to representation. So there are normally two sources of error in data when you analyze the quality from a survey research perspective. Measurement error on the one hand, which means is the information included fit for purpose, as it was mentioned before? Is this the right information to measure what I intend to measure actually? Is the income indicated through text declaration fit to assess the creditworthiness of a person? Okay, I'm short on time. The measurement is the one thing, because this is what we do when we use data. We want to measure a real-world concept, and then errors of representation is the other side. And this means structural missing data, and to what extent does the data cover the population I want to generalize for? And this is, again, this example of face recognition. If you only train on white male faces, it might not work on other groups. Just a quick example on biased data. Internet users in 2018, I just like the statistics, so it's a very good example. 1 in 3 of large enterprises in the EU uses big data analytics. Almost half of those, we heard before, use geolocation data, and 45% of those using big data analytics use data from social media. However, of course, we know not everyone is in the internet, even if it seems so nowadays. So only 9 in 10 households in the EU have access to the internet. 11% of individuals in the EU say they never use the internet. And only 56%, according to Eurostat statistics, say they participate actively in social media. And so data from the internet as such are biased, of course. They underrepresent especially older people, poorer people, as well as people with lower education, and here it's especially women. So this is just an example that if you use data drawn from the internet, you need to be very much aware that this does not cover the entire population. To conclude, low quality data in machine learning systems and training data, especially if they're not representative or they do not measure well what you intend to measure, they can impact on your right to non-discrimination. And there is more. So with concrete case studies, we hope also to come up with more analysis, for example, good administration, right to fair trial, and the others I mentioned before. There's not a big question mark, but there are discussions, I say, on the applicability of data protection legislation in the area, especially if you use anonymized training data. I think tomorrow there is a session on application of GDPR on when you use inferred data based on machine learning systems, for example. So there's a big discussion on to what extent data protection legislation kicks in on training data. On the ways forward, I think, as it was mentioned before, human rights impact assessments are crucial. Whenever you deploy a system, there should be a human rights impact assessment. And when there is an element of machine learning that is trained on specific data, it's important to assess the quality. What has the algorithm learned? What was the basis for learning? Here, dataset descriptions are an important way forward. There was also another session yesterday on nutrition labels for data. And there are several, so this is also a work in progress. Again, I would like to point out that we can draw from lots of experiences from data archives. There are well-established large archives that share survey data, but they are also doing more and more administrative data from the internet, and they have a very good process on how data should be described, like where do the data come from, what information is included in the data, who is covered in the data collection. Very important, what information is missing? Is it just missing for specific groups or not? And then what's the time frame and the geographical coverage? On that note, thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for insisting that, as you said, when the tool is not fit for purposes that are set before the data processing, then fundamental rights impact can happen and will probably happen. So as you were saying, there are challenges, but we do have other fields that can provide with solutions. Social studies, you were mentioning the data archive. So we can also look for solutions in other fields of study that wouldn't be directly linked to artificial intelligence. We do not have to invent everything. So I begin by saying that there is very few research on this subject, and as we can see, there's a lot to say because we're a little bit short on time for the questions. So I would like to open the floor directly for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Hello, Tobias Morschus from Datenschutzraum Germany. Two short questions. One question for you. Do you have a 4x4 matrix to evaluate the quality of your 4x4 matrix? How good is it filled? And the second question is, shouldn't there be an upper and a lower boundary for data quality? Because if we look at the development, data quality becomes, or at least the precision gets more and more detailed, so you can pick the fingerprint from a photograph or take the password from sensors from the smartphone. So if you have the most accurate data, you get a lot more than you have in the past. And so shouldn't you have also an upper quality boundary?
Daniel, do you want to give the first reply on your 4x4 matrix?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. I understood, of course, that I understood the joke, but I think still you made a very valuable point. So what is it? You have a 4x4 system, and then nobody uses it. So there's the safeguards. They are described on the one side in the regulation. The 4x4 system is described in the Europol regulation. But there are technical safeguards that these codes are given to the information. Otherwise, they don't go in the database. So you have to give a code. The way then the information is assessed is again controlled by the Data Protection Office, by Europol, to look in compliance. And data quality is, and I didn't say this in my initial statement, is always an aspect of our inspections. Data quality of the files is always checked by the supervisor authority when they come for regular inspection. You will see this in the inspection reports, in the annual report of the European Data Protection Supervisor. When they come to check Europol files, data quality is one of the #1 items to be checked. And but once again, also with the risk that I repeat myself on this one, 4x4 is important for data protection. Therefore, it is also a key point that is supervised and controlled, but it has an equal value for the analysts working with the file. Yeah, because if we don't use that 4x4 system, we don't know the value of the data, you could say. We don't know the value of the data. We cannot do our job at the end. We cannot support member states, authorities in doing their job in investigations. And ultimately, it might even have an impact on judicial proceedings. Because if you have then this information going into a judicial procedure and you are not clear about whether the data quality of this personal data is sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if some other speaker would like to intervene also. If we move to second question, please.
I'm Hiroshi Naka from Japan Nikkei. And in my impression, the data subjects know his or her data most accurately. Is it right? And then, if I'm right in this sense, the self-data control rights of data subject is very important. And from this, the data control, for this, he or she may ask the data controller to revise his or her data if it's not accurate. Then the point is, the problem is how data controller trust his or her, trust him or her. That is a very important topic. And it may be the so-called the internet identity problem. How do we do it with some technologies? That's the question.
Thank you very much. So how can data controllers trust information provided by data subjects to be accurate? Is your question directed to one speaker, or it's just for all 4 speakers? All the speakers. So, who wants to give a first answer to this question? Maybe David and then Daniel?
Thank you for the question. I can only respond from a specific perspective on this. Again, how we would do it in survey research, for example. And I mean, in surveys, it's quite crucial to have an honest answer to questions and how honest information is and how accurate information is. And this is why, like in survey research, a lot of effort goes into question framing. Because the way you ask questions, people can impact quite strongly on the way the information is provided. So you have to be really clear. Often questions are not clear at all. They have 2 points in them. They are leading questions in a specific direction. So investigation of questions when you collect data from data subjects, I think is a very important tool. What we also do in surveys, for example, we do cognitive pre-tests where we test questions and then discuss with the specific groups like how they understand. And this way, I think a lot of quality can be improved on collection of data from individuals.
Thank you, David. And as Daniel wanted to speak, and also Athena, I would like to provide an answer to your question.
So, because you mentioned data subject requests, and I mentioned already in my introductory statement, there is this link data subject request and data quality. And I think you asked specifically about what is, because it's an important point that you make. Somebody goes and says, I'm Daniel Drever, but I'm not Daniel Drever, but I would like to have the data of Daniel Drever. And how far has you as a data controller have then to control that Daniel Drever actually asked for his information? As a data protection officer, but I'm talking from the law enforcement perspective, for Europol it's easy because the identity is checked on national level by the national authorities and by the national data protection authorities. But if there are still doubts in the process, I think we have to be very careful that there is no investigation then started on the data subject, because then data protection gets absurd if we do that, and it would be not in line with the legislator asks us. So I think also in this, checking the identity of the ones that asked for his or her data, there must be limits. They are not described because it's a very specific item that you mention now. They're not yet described in legal text, but I think at a certain moment we have to do that.
Thank you. Athena?
Yes, just another aspect I wanted to add here is that the level of the quality of the data that the data subjects will provide to a great extent depends also on the level that they feel protected in different contexts. And then again, it's about the measures that have been put in place to make them feel protected. So, for example, we are listening often about several types of anonymized surveys. It's a different type of survey, but we see it often online. But what does it mean, anonymized in practice? And what guarantees do you have that these data are truly anonymized and they're not indirect identifiers that can still link back to the data subjects and so on? So this is, I think, also an important element that can build trust from the data subjects to the data controllers, and then, of course, it will increase finally the quality of the data, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. And finally, Pat also would like to...
Just very briefly, I think that often a data subject may not even know that a controller has data about them. It's particularly challenging. And in this space, also, to get information about whether or not a controller is using an algorithm, is using artificial intelligence, is using machine learning to process data, and to understand what aspect in that process is inaccurate. It may be that you've got my correct name, but it may be that other signals that you're collecting in relation to my connected life and using in the algorithm, we had that kind of conversation this morning, is the processing, is the algorithm itself inaccurate or the data inaccurate? And I'd say, turn it around also, because you're saying, how can a controller trust the data subject? Well, I'd say, how can a data subject trust the controller when there's such a lack of transparency over the use of algorithms and the deployment of algorithms and the impact that has on people's reputation, on their credit score, for example. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question, I think.
Hi, Walter from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I was pleasantly surprised of this focus on the purpose in relation to data quality. My question, however, is especially related to law enforcement. There's a big push where unconnected personal data is seen as a data quality problem, but this is also data that is collected for different purposes. So how do we still make sure that fundamental rights are respected? Or we also go for interoperability, where we are going to connect this data, collected for different purposes, and therefore different data quality standards.
Thank you very much. Is your question directed to the law enforcement? I just wanted to double check.
Maybe also technical measures can also.
Okay, so please, Daniel, another question for you.
Well, the question deserves an additional panel. Yeah, my suggestion to CPDP to consider this, because the interoperability that you talk about and the connection is of course a topic that is not excluded from data quality. So I have to leave it with the statement that I say all the points that I made during my introductory statements, they are applied to all information that we hold. The Europol data processing is that information comes from, is provided by member states or by third states, or we collect the information ourselves from the sources where we are allowed to collect it. But the data quality standards have to be either ensured on member states level, or when we collect the data, and I think you're talking about this, that more and more sources are available for law enforcement to get it, the data quality responsibility is then not with that source. The data quality responsibility is then with Europol in such a case. But I think I have to leave it at that point now, because this really deserves a separate discussion, a longer discussion.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that Pat would like to say a few words on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if you look at law enforcement, they often rely on data that's collected and processed in the private sector, and particularly in the mobile space. So they will come after subscriber account information, for example, or call records. Now, the mobile operators lack entirely any consistent approach to how they record people's data. It may be that, for example, I buy the phone, but it's recorded in my name, yet my son, who's 17, is the person that's using the phone. So the user is not the person that is registered in relation to the account that, again, can have. So how, and that, in relation to purpose, was collected just to be able to manage and bill me, right? It wasn't collected for the purposes of law enforcement, but a byproduct, a bypurpose of that, a secondary purpose, is law enforcement. And trust me, this data is used on a hugely massive scale. And in some countries in Europe, sadly, in my view, some countries require mandatory registration of mobile phones, which I think is an awful policy, but nonetheless, it is in some countries. So a good question, and I'm sure Europol are grappling with it.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Interoperability is a very crucial question and very topical right now. The FRA also made a research on interoperability implications on fundamental rights for the large-scale IT databases that are used for migration purposes. So if you are interested on this, you can also, I don't see the speaker, but yeah, if you are interested in this, you can also check this report that we have made that is trying to go deep into this question. Thanks. And we have another question, please.
Hi, thank you. It's Megan. I work at Liberty, which is a human rights organisation in the UK. Thank you all for your presentations. I want to pick up on the training data set point and ask about the context of facial recognition technology. So the police in the UK are using private technology, and I think there's a really big issue here of public use of private technology, because the police in the UK don't know what the training data set is that the private company who have manufactured the technology are using. It's a trade secret. And if they can't access that data set, they can't analyze it and be sure that it's free of bias and discrimination, and that their technology is not having a discriminatory effect. So how can we hold public authorities like the police to account and be sure that the technology they're using is not discriminatory if private companies can just assert trade secrets and not reveal that information?
Thank you very much for this interesting question. David, would you like to reply?
Thank you. Interesting and big question. Allows me to mention aside, we have also a mini project on facial recognition technology where we also look closer into this technology and all these implications. So more to come than my answer now. Facial recognition technology, I mean, there are different aspects how it's being used. One is to identify specific individuals, and the other is to deduce characteristics. The thing I was mentioning where you do gender detection based on faces, which is also used. It is a tricky question on like the copyright issues and to hold accountability of fundamental rights. And as we say, human rights impact assessment is the only thing we have at the moment. And here it's just a call for transparency and to assess the accuracy of facial recognition technology. And also what I didn't mention because I was looking into training data, which is one important aspect, but this is also like what is being put out, the inferred data. And here a lot can be done actually with these technologies as well to test them, how well they work for different groups and how accurate they are. I mean, there was a, for the analysis of how a specific system works, it needs to be looked into context and then the entire system, including the training data. So there's of course a call to make these assessments publicly available and then in addition to this provide information like where do the training data come from. In this well-known example of gender detection, luckily someone knew this, that it was just fed with white male faces. If you don't know this information, then it's really difficult to find out.
Thank you very much. Pat, would you like to have a few words?
I'll just say one thing. It's a really good question and a very important question. Today in the UK, one of the most surveilled societies in the world, I'd say. And that may actually, processing that you described may invoke the GDPR, well, it certainly will for the private entity, but it may also invoke the Law Enforcement Directive and Part 3 of the UK Data Protection Act, which nonetheless imposes almost identical obligations on law enforcement. And the Article 29 Working Party have issued an opinion in 2017 on the Law Enforcement Directive, which includes things like data protection by design, it includes things like data quality, and all the other obligations that are imposed on the normal controller. So I suggest the law does provide for what you want, and it's a way to articulate that then back with the regulators, and particularly with Tony Porter in the UK, I would suggest.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm just taking no more on this. Well, I'd like to thank our speakers for highlighting the challenges, but also for offering potential solutions in order to ensure that data quality requirements are met. Thank you very much for coming to this session, for this very interesting question that we had that have broadened also the scope and show that data quality is important beyond fundamental rights and will stay a very hot topic. So thank you very much and enjoy CPDP today.